This video is brought to you by NewsVoice. The news is broken. Almost all US media is owned by just a handful of big corporations. Fake news, obviously a huge problem as well, and finding something unbiased can be pretty darn tricky. NewsVoice is revolutionizing the news landscape. It's an app that gives you a personalized news feed by aggregating major news sites as well as international and independent media. It gives a much-needed balance. Each news story shows multiple sources, which are all tagged with their bias and perspective. The news affects almost everything in our lives, and what we hear and read shapes which persons we trust, what we eat, what we buy, how we vote, even how we think. NewsVoice is created by its readers, as you can upvote stories that you find interesting so more people will see them. It's essentially a democratized platform for news. Plus, it saves you time. You can get all of the news, all of the sources in one app so that you can be better informed. Oh, and it's also totally free, so there's that. Anyway, get started with NewsVoice today for free through the link below. It's available on both Google Play and the App Store, and let's get into the video. With about 1 million diagnosed cases, the United States is suffering a severe thrashing from coronavirus. At the time of making this video, more than 22,000 people had died in New York State alone from COVID-19. It's a situation that, in the same way as has happened in many other places around the globe, has forced the governor of New York State, Andrew Cuomo, to declare the closure of schools and shops.
We are now the epicenter of this crisis. New York Mayor Bill de Blasio at a press conference Friday.
The consequences of the coronavirus are reaching all corners of US society, including some that I'm sure would never have crossed your mind. For example, it is clear that this virus does not respect walls or electric fences, so one of the big concerns facing many states is in prisons and within the inmate population. And don't forget, we're talking about the United States, the country with the highest number of prisoners on the planet. More than 2 million people are behind bars. It's a situation that opens the door to potential mass contagion, uncontrollable riots, or even the lack of enough staff to take care of these places. All of this has led to 15 states having to put in place extraordinarily tough measures that even prohibit the access of lawyers to prisons. And it doesn't end there. Many counties are reevaluating their arrest policies in a way that I swear will leave many of you aghast. For example, in Baltimore, one of the 25 most dangerous cities in the world, charges are no longer being filed for drug possession or supply offenses or for issues related to the world's oldest trade. That is, the authorities have decided to look the other way for the duration of the health crisis. But that's not all. Not only is it about putting as few people in jail as possible, but some states like Montana are taking it a step further and have already discussed the idea of starting to release as many inmates as possible, especially those who are convicted of non-violent crimes who, account for about half of the entire prison population.
Universities and hotels you can close. I'm left with people I can't send home, says Sheriff Dart.
As we told you, the coronavirus is reaching every corner of US society, and the Navy is no exception. Not even the USS Theodore Roosevelt, one of the all-powerful Nimitz-class nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, has managed to dodge the pandemic. In mid-March, while doing maneuvers in the South China Sea, the coronavirus boarded the Roosevelt and the nightmare began. Barely a week later, a report in the form of a letter from the carrier's own captain was leaked to the press. In it, Captain Crozier alerted his colleagues and superiors to the unsustainable situation on board the aircraft carrier because of coronavirus and urged disembarking the entire crew as soon as possible in order to curb the contagion. However, the story didn't end well. Despite having the support of his superiors and his crew, the White House terminated Captain Crozier's command of the carrier. The reason? Well, they claimed his letter incited alarmism. The thing is, soon after, Navy Secretary himself resigned.
We are not at war. Sailors do not need to die. Brett Crozier, former captain of the aircraft carrier USS Theodore Roosevelt.
And so we go from prisons to the Navy to the next census. For the first time in its 230-year history, this statistical document may be in danger. And yes, okay, so many of you might be thinking, well, Simon, a census? I mean, how on earth can that be a priority right now, right? But this is not just any census. It costs over $15 billion, making it the most expensive census in the world. It's produced every 10 years, and the result results serve to define the entire political architecture of the country. We're talking, for example, about the distribution of seats in Congress or the distribution of delegates by state in the presidential elections. Once again, as you can see, the coronavirus crisis is reaching into every corner of the country. But at this point, many of you might be wondering, faced with all of this mess, what has the Trump administration's response been to this crisis? How far does the power of the President of the United States reach in such situations? Which states are doing better and which are doing worse? Well, let's take a look.
I have the ultimate authority. The President of the United States has the authority to do what the President has the authority to do, which is very powerful. The President of the United States calls the shots. If we weren't here for the states, you would have had a problem in this country like you've never seen before. When somebody's the President of the United States, the authority is total. And that's the way it's got to be. The authority is total. It's total. And the governors know that.
Donald Trump's response.
Donald Trump's position on the coronavirus has done more laps than a Formula One car on the Monte Carlo circuit. And that makes us wonder, has the White House been sufficiently prepared for the impact of this pandemic? Exactly how far does the federal administration's capacity reach? Well, this seems to be something that causes a lot of confusion, so let me explain. Although the President of the United States is the one in the international press who gets all the front pages, the truth is that his role and that of the federal government within US borders are actually quite limited. For example, in general trade issues are the responsibility of Congress, and decisions in health or emergency situations fall primarily to state governors. Indeed, even in the face of major catastrophes, it is the governors themselves who must ask the federal government for help if they deem it appropriate. So, as much as Donald Trump thinks he is the Yankee version of Xi Jinping, a president who can do and undo things at will, the truth is that the US Constitution leaves him very little room.
Hamilton and Jefferson and Madison and Washington, they wrote a document that's called the Constitution of the United States, and it is an explicit and intricate balance of power between the federal government and the state governments. And it says the federal government does not have absolute power. It says the exact opposite that the president said.
The authority is total.
It says that would be a king. We would have had King George Washington. We didn't have King George Washington, and we don't have King Trump. We have President Trump. The states created the federal government, not the other way around. We have the 10th Amendment that is explicit. Certain responsibilities are state responsibilities. Health, welfare, quarantine, those are health responsibilities.
Yeah.
So the president should not even think of going there.
So then, does that mean that Trump has his hands tied? That his administration just doesn't work? Well, no, of course not. The mere fact that they were able to activate the war economy proves this. By the way, this is a topic that we will be dedicating an entire video to in the next few days, so do not forget to subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't done so already. The fact is that although the power of the federal government is generally quite limited, in the case of the coronavirus crisis, the role of several federal agencies has been key. We're talking about organizations like Fema, the CDC, and the FDA. 3 Trump administration-led agencies that during these crises have been a real disaster. Yes, a real disaster. Look, in early 2020, when the existence of this epidemic became widely known, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, decided that no testing kits from any other country were to be authorized. In other words, the US was going to develop its own test, a project that would also be led exclusively by the government itself. As a result, the FDA instructed the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, another public agency, to develop a test for coronavirus. At the same time, and pay attention here, it forbade any other institution, whether private, such as pharmaceutical or public companies, like many laboratories, to develop this test. So it seemed the federal government wanted a monopoly all for itself. And it's at this point that this is where the disaster really began. From mid-January to February 28th, the CDC produced 160,000 tests, which doesn't sound too bad. But hold on a second, because of those 160,000 tests, only 4,000 could be used, and the rest had to just be thrown away. Why? Well, because most of the tests yielded inconclusive results. Basically, the tests failed more than a fairground shotgun, apparently from contamination at CDC labs in Atlanta. In other words, it was a mess, and a colossal one at that.
After Trump promised, quote, anybody can get coronavirus testing, patients and doctors still complain of roadblocks. While CDC coronavirus tests stalled for 6 weeks, a German lab made 1.4 million tests.
Finally, after such a mess up, the CDC gave in and the government allowed the other public laboratories to try and develop their own products. What's more, the FDA also allowed large pharmaceutical companies like Roche to give it a try. So those 6 crucial weeks were just thrown away, plainly because the federal government wanted to reserve the spotlight for itself. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't see what was wrong with allowing other institutions or private companies to develop their own tests. It just seems crazy that that wasn't allowed. But listen, this was really just the beginning. We also have the case of Fema, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which is the body responsible for distributing health equipment to states requesting their assistance. Well, it looks like this organization is also having a tough time. In an interview on CNN on March the 22nd, Peter Gaynor, the director of Fema, acknowledged that the total lack of organization was such that they did not even know the stock of materials that the agency handled. That is to say, they had no idea what capacity they had to deal with the situation. And take note, because we're not just talking about January or even February. This was at the end of March. Moreover, their lack of foresight has created a lot of problems for Fema when it comes to buying health supplies. Basically, they were too late and now supplies are scarce.
How many masks does the federal government have right now, and when can they get to local hospitals?
Well, when it comes to supplies,
we have been shipping from the national stockpile for weeks. The demand.
Do you have any specific numbers on how many masks the federal government has been able to acquire and how many have gone out the door to hospitals? Do you have even a rough number?
I can't give you a rough number.
You understand, though, of course, that the inability of the federal government to give a number in terms of masks alarms people. It makes people concerned that there aren't masks going out the door.
Then there are the airports where health controls were noticeable for their absence. At this point, given the disastrous track record of these agencies, the lack of airport prevention, and the influence of their political discourse, the federal government's ability to act against coronavirus is really quite limited. And that leads us directly to a key question. What role are the individual states playing?
Are the United States really united?
We've seen that Fema is having a lot of trouble buying health supplies, but they're not the only ones. From the moment the coronavirus began to show itself as a real and potentially very serious problem, the states themselves also began en masse to turn to a market already scarce in supplies to buy materials, which led to them to have to bid against each other in a desperate battle to get any possible protective material at whatever the cost. The result was that within a matter of days, prices rose astronomically.
For New York, 58-cent medical masks now priced at $7.50 each. Bloomberg.
Look, it's important to note the basic reason that prices skyrocketed is that buyers themselves, the states, were willing to pay a lot more to snatch supplies from other customers, that is, from other states. It's simply the result of scarcity, a question of basic economics, supply and demand. But let's not get distracted. The point is that right now, New York is the epicenter of the coronavirus within the United States. What's interesting is that despite this, New York's approval rating of their governor, Democrat Andrew Cuomo, is sky high. New York State is even being presented by some media as a role model of crisis management. But hold on a moment, because as we say around here, all that glitters is not gold. The New York governor's hand trembled when it came to closing schools across the state, and he resisted for days before finally decreeing the confinement order. In fact, if we at VisualPolitik had to choose a governor to give an award to, we would go for a much less media popular case, but one who deserves all of our recognition, and that's Mike Dewine, the governor of Ohio, the 73-year-old Republican who ignored Donald Trump himself. It may not make headlines, but Dewine was the first governor in the entire country to have no hesitation in shutting down schools across his state. You could say that from the very first moment, this governor took the bull by the horns. Faced with the danger of a looming pandemic, he closed bars and restaurants, asked all the universities in the state to suspend face-to-face classes, and addressed citizens, asking them to forget about attending mass sporting events. All this when there were only a dozen confirmed cases and 0 people had died in Ohio at the time. To give you a comparison, Isabel Diaz Ayuso, the president of the Spanish region of Madrid, which is one of the most affected regions in the world, announced the closure of schools on March the 9th, by which time Madrid had already accumulated almost 600 positive cases and more than a dozen deaths.
Mistakes that I've made throughout my career have generally been because I didn't have enough facts. I didn't dig deep enough. So I made up my mind I was going to have the best information, the best data available. Mike Dewine.
And that's not all. When Donald Trump set out to try and open the economy for Easter, Dewine very elegantly replied that he was not convinced. But first things first.
When people are dying, when people don't feel safe, the economy is not going to come back. Mike Dewine.
But if we have the good example, I think we also have to look at a bad one. If we had to give a Rotten Tomato award to a governor for his or her management during this crisis, that person would most likely be Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, Republican Trump supporter to the core. And you will see that unlike other governors, DeSantis turned a deaf ear to the expert information that was available, and he merely followed the president's recommendations to the letter. Yes, Florida closed some beaches and some parks, but while half the state had already decreed stay-at-home orders, many Florida beaches were still full of tourists. And if you consider that Florida is considered a pensioner's paradise in the United States, you can get an idea of the potential risk this governor's decisions have caused. Finally, on April the 1st, in the face of the escalation of events, the governor was forced to decree the order to stay at home and impose mandatory quarantines on people entering from other states such as New York. In other words, he was slower than a tortoise with rheumatism. Anyway, there you can see 2 states acting very differently, and throughout the crisis in the United States, it's the governors who are the main players. That said, Trump's political influence is more than obvious, and you know that this is an election year, which makes the president very, very nervous. And of course, news like this doesn't help.
US now has 22 million unemployed, wiping out a decade of job gains. Washington Post.
And here is where the new White House political strategy for the 2020 election rears its head. A health-level strategy that reinforces the idea that China and the World Health Organization are the big culprits in all of this.
Trump halts World Health Organization funding over handling of coronavirus outbreak. CNN.
Which may be true, but of course that doesn't erase your accountability if you've been looking the other way, does it? And in this crisis, the US federal government hasn't exactly been a shining star, shall we say. And then, thinking further down the track in terms of the economy, well, look at these messages.
Liberate Michigan. Liberate Minnesota. Liberate Virginia and save your great Second Amendment. It is under siege.
With this speech, what Trump and his campaign team are after is making it clear that if economic damage occurs, it will be because of the governors who ignored him. Even if the governors of these states are acting on what international experience says, they have to deal with the problem of internal criticism. Anyway, what will the Trump administration's next move be? What are the consequences of this entire crisis for the US economy? Could all of this cost Trump the presidency? Well, leave your answer in the comments below, and I really do hope you enjoyed this video. Please do hit like if you did, and don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos. Also, please do check out our fantastic sponsor for this episode, News Voice, who I'm linking to below, and thank you for watching.
And if you want to learn more about politics and hear even more of my lovely voice, you can join us at Reconsider Media. We have a podcast at reconsidermedia.com/podcast. See you there.